The topic of my talk is something like conservation that builds community. And it is a focus of a lot of what we do at the Clark Fork Coalition, because we found that it has that it's successful. And we started to realize that, let me back up and tell you a little bit about our work. We're 20 years old. We were founded in 1985 to protect and restore water quality in the Clark Fork River Basin. And about, 5 years ago, probably, the board sat down with the staff at the coalition and sort of rethought what it is that we do. And we changed our mission. And it sounds really sort of like we're splitting hairs. But for us, it was a big and important thing to change from to protect and restore water quality in the Clark Fork River Basin to protect and restore the Clark Fork watershed. And for us, that was about the understanding that if we focus just on the river, if we focus just on water quality, just on the things that are necessary for sort of vitality within the river, that we're missing the boat. That we're not going to have a healthy river unless we have healthy communities, and we're not going to have healthy communities unless we have a healthy river. That the two are inextricably tied together. And so then all of a sudden that had a sort of great bearing on our work. Like, well, what does that mean? That means that we have to pay attention to ridgetop to ridgetop, if you're looking at a watershed, water flowing downhill. And in between ridgetop and ridgetop are big human communities. And so all of a sudden we realized we need to begin to look at the health of our human communities as well. Because we're not going to be successful on taking care of the river unless the human communities are healthy too. And so we published a report called State of the Clark Fork in 2005, which looked at economic, social, and ecological indicators of health in the basin. And we found some interesting things. And things that made us go, well, yeah, but nice to sort of see the data play out on paper in the form of graphs and GIS maps. And that was the poorest places in the Clark Fork River Basin also happen to be the most polluted. Guess what? People who have options tend to not flock to really polluted places. And the Clark Fork River Basin happens to be home to the largest Superfund site in the country. And then I'm going to back up really quickly. For those of you who don't know, the basin drains most of western Montana. Headwaters are in Butte. And when I say most of western Montana, I mean pretty much everything. The whole Flathead system drains into the Clark Fork, the Bitterroot, the Blackfoot, everything but the Kootenai up here. This is the Yak and Troy and Libby. But otherwise, if it's west of the divide, it's in the Clark Fork drainage.
East and west.
Well, that's a matter of semantics. So we stop at Lake Pend Oreille. The outflow of which is at Sandpoint. The outflow of Lake Pend Oreille is the Pend Oreille River, which flows into the Columbia, which of course flows into the Pacific. So here we are at the headwaters of the Columbia River Basin. It's the country's largest Superfund site because of the rich mining history at Butte. Butte gave the world copper, fueled the Industrial Revolution. The Clark Fork carted away the waste. And here we are 120-ish years later, now literally paying the price to do this remarkable cleanup. And we got a little glimmer into this notion of conservation as it is tied into community in our Milltown Dam work. We launched a campaign in 2000 to remove Milltown Dam because it's, all the reasons that I'm sure you sort of heard during the effort, but it's old, it's unstable, and more importantly, it has millions of cubic yards of toxic sediments stacked up behind it that were polluting groundwater for the local communities and also polluting the river during big storms. Sediments would get kicked up and over the dam, kill fish. And when we launched that campaign, sort of even our sort of close friends were like, yeah, good idea, good luck. Because it seems sort of crazy. because Montana Power Company still owned the dam, and it was literally and politically a sort of figurative powerhouse, politically and literally making power. ARCO was responsible for cleaning up the sediments because ARCO had bought the Anaconda Mining Company. Two huge corporate players with quite a lot of political clout, and the Clark Fork Coalition at then a budget of about $180,000 a year and a lot of goodwill. It seemed sort of David taking on Goliath. But very, very quickly, it no longer became the coalition's idea. It became the community's idea. And when it became the community's idea, and when it became a community issue about the vision for who and what we want to be as small communities in western Montana, Missoula, Bonner, Milltown, the day that happened, or the sort of days, because it didn't all happen in one day, but when that happened, we won. That's what turned the tide. It wasn't just about bull trout not being able to get past an old dam. It wasn't just about arsenic that lingered in groundwater. It wasn't just about fiscal responsibility of a company. It was sort of all those things tied together, plus a community saying, well, what if? What if we are the kind of a place that says, no, we want a different future. We want those toxics gone, and we want that unstable dam gone. And oh yeah, by the way, we're then going to use that and build on it for redeveloping the communities that have been most affected by that Superfund site, which are the small communities right next to it, Bonner, Milltown, Piltsville. What could that look like if we didn't say we're done simply by taking out the sediments in the dam? If we say, okay, now that the sediments in the dam are gone, what can these small communities, how can they benefit from this? What does that look like? And how do we tie in sort of literally and figuratively those communities to Missoula, economically and recreationally, and then of course by the big thing, the river that ties them together. When people began to frame it that way, it no longer became an environmental issue, and when it wasn't an environmental issue, it wasn't politically scary, it was something to do. So we thought, okay, so when conservation it no longer is some scary eco thing, when it's not an environmental issue, and when it's a community issue, it becomes a no-brainer. We all, who wants to live in a toxic place? Who wants to live in a place that doesn't sort of sustain its place? And so that got me to sort of thinking like, we, the collective sort of we in the environmental movement, have perhaps framed the issues incorrectly over the decades. That we're so focused on the political win, and we're so focused on whatever the issue was or is, that we take it out of its context. And the context is, we all live on this planet, we all got to figure out how to share it with these other beings. But when we just sort of pluck it out and we say, need to protect salamander, need to protect grizzly bears, need to protect, whatever that it is, this forest, and we don't put it in the context of the larger human community, we risk failure, because people can then separate themselves and say, oh yeah, well, whatever, grizzly bears are fine in Alaska, so we can write them off here. Or salamanders, who needs those? And when we distance ourselves, it's so easy to just do, do what a dog does, just sort of look the other way, and then it all goes away. And that is what we invite, we, the environmental community, what we invited sort of society to do, to just ignore it and say, well, it's not too bad because, and rationalize it away. And I'd like to say we sort of masterminded the opposite of that we didn't do that at the Milltown campaign, but we just flat out tripped into it through good fortune, but then learned from it and said, oh, wait a second, we were very intentional about not making it just about fish, because we thought we're going to need everything we've got. We got to throw everything we've got at this because it's too big. It can't just be about fish, can't just be about arsenic, we got to just find something new every week and throw it at it. Oh yeah, it's not being safe. Oh yeah, it's about economics. Oh, but then we learned from that and said, wait a second, add all those things up together, and that's a community deal. And so we've taken that lesson upstream to the upper Clark Fork, where making something a community issue is very different than in Missoula. The Deer Lodge Valley is big geographically, small demographically. Probably, gosh, there's 5,000 people, I think, in Powell County, and North Powell County includes the Upper Blackfoot, so, you know, probably 2,500 people in the Deer Lodge Valley, maybe 3,000, living along a river that is about to undergo a $100 million cleanup that we pushed for successfully over 20 years, advocated for cleanup, 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 at the expense of not ever saying, and what about the people who live here? What we said in our sort of old guard environmentalist way was, oh yeah, well, of course it's going to be fine for them. Like, what's not to like about $100 million being spent on your ranch lands? Get over it. But we never really sort of tackled that issue and said, what would it mean for the people who live along this river and this community to have this huge thing come happen to them? We're lucky in that we won the political battle despite having the backing of the local community, but we're stupid in going about it that way. It was just dumb. So that the political backing of that place, the company had it, ARCO had it. You know, ARCO saying, really, it's the devil you know. You know, it's okay, you know how to keep your cows away from those toxics. It's okay, you know, Mother Nature is bringing it back, and you don't want the federal government coming on your land telling you what to do. Pretty fine message. They were preaching community. We were preaching environmentalism. Again, we're lucky because we won that political battle. Science won in the end. But now we have the very uphill battle of having a community that feels like something's being shoved down their throats. And of course, they're the ones, because they live and work and ranch alongside this river, that can make or break the cleanup. And we, the Clark Fork Coalition, are sort of Johnny-come-lately to this notion of, good Lord, you know, we could spend $100 million in this valley with the collective we. It's really ARCO. ARCO can write a check for $100 million to clean up this river, and it could fail. And it could fail simply because the community has not metaphorically bought in. And so therefore, could do something as simple as, if you're going to revegetate 50 feet of the river corridor like the plan calls for, well, revegetation and cows don't necessarily mix in those first 5 years. And so cows can undo the cleanup. And why not? If you're a person who's opposed to the federal government coming in and telling you how to, you know, if you bought that line, like, why wouldn't you let your cows loose and say, whatever? You know, except for there's sort of legal mechanisms to stop you from doing that. Well, that doesn't help, because those legal mechanisms just get people all the sort of angry about. It's this thing called the government coming, and environmentalists coming at me to say I'm not doing my job right. You know, boy, there's a nice message to give people. You're not doing your job right. We don't trust you to not take care of your land. I mean, that's just horrible. It's like the worst thing you could say to somebody. I mean, in fact, if they're not a public figure, and you know, I mean, there's laws against that. By saying, you know, you're bad at what you do or you're criminal at what you do, we have laws to protect people from that. And here we are inferring it. And so we are trying to flip that on its head, and have been working with the community in the Deer Lodge Valley to say, okay, let's put that political fight of how much cleanup behind us, because it's done. EPA has said how much cleanup we're going to have. We know what it's going to be. Now that it's coming, now that $100 million is going to be spent in your valley, how can that benefit the human communities who live alongside this river? Because if it doesn't sort of lift up economically the communities as well, I think it will fail. I mean, don't get me wrong, ecologically there's a lot of questions to begin with, like, do we know how to put 56 river miles back together? Open question. We think we do. but it's not a practice that humans go about every day. And so we think we have the science right on what's going to be best for that river. We're going to have to hope that the science is right. We're going to have to hope that we have the humility to learn as we go in a 10-year process and sort of do mid-course corrections. So let's just, for the course of this conversation, say, okay, that's a given. We know that the science part's going to be right. If the science part is right and the trout come back, and the trout are already there, about 1/5 of what they should be, but you know, you can go there and fish and catch some nice brown trout.
Can you eat them?
Yeah.
Safely?
Yeah. Metals accumulate in the organs of fish, not their muscle, and of course that's what we eat. And so, I mean, you can eat the pike in Milltown Reservoir if you wanted. So yeah, I mean, I exactly. I don't know that I would quite enjoy it, but even you could do it. You could do so at safe levels. But plus, it's a catch and release fishery anyway. You know, the trout fishermen are doing it for the sport, not necessarily for the sustainability factor of it. But in any case, say the fish come back. We've got this gorgeous, you can picture it, 56 river miles, beautifully put back together riparian corridor, fish, ducks, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful open working landscape. How long is that going to last? Look at every other valley in western Montana where we've got those amenities, and one of two things happens. It develops like Ravalli County, sort of willy-nilly, and everybody gets their little slice of heaven until heaven goes away, or the culture really shifts, and wealthy people from the outside come buy up their huge slices of heaven. So we keep this ecological integrity, but we lose the underlying sort of culture of the place. Both of those are not A+ answers. You know, one of them's a really bad answer, and so here we have the ability to sort of, how ironic that because a place has been just incredibly polluted, it hasn't had that host of other pressure on it that all these other valleys in western Montana and the West have had. But that's going to change. And so now we're working with the community to say, you get to drive. You know, the company, which almost since this place was homesteaded, the company has been in charge. Because right after the valley was sort of settled for agriculture, or right as it was being settled for agriculture, the mining boom was beginning to happen in Butte. And the Anaconda Mining Company ran the state, and certainly ran the valley. And when the smeltermen put the stack in Anaconda, and whole herds of sheep would fall over dead, and cattle would fall over dead, miles away, because it was so incredibly toxic, the ranchers fought the smeltermen. It's an unbelievable little slice of Montana history. That fight went up to the Supreme Court. Teddy Roosevelt got involved, and the company won. All the ranchers wanted was the company to buy them out so that they could go someplace else where their sheep wouldn't fall over and die. And the company won. And so now here we are, 100 years later, and the company has lost, finally, and has to make amends. And the amends this time isn't to buy them out, but it's to put the place back together as reasonably as we can. But the company's going to write that check, and then they're going to leave. And so there's going to be this sort of void of power in the valley. And the question is, who's going to fill that void? It's going to be outside developers? Is it going to be something that we don't yet foresee? Is it going to be feedlot operations? Or, as we're positing, it could be the community. Community could step up to the plate and say, guess what? After 100 years, we're going to drive. This is what we see as the vision for our community, and here's how we're going to work together to go get it. And we've got this unbelievable infusion of money to help us get there. And so that's what we're working with the community to do. And as you can imagine, and this has been, a transition in the last 3 or so years, as you can imagine, there's still some people there who are like, weren't you the ones who foisted this down our throats to begin with? Like, wait a minute. But some sort of key people have said, all right, no, really, let's put that fight behind us. And if our vision for this valley is, as we've sort of sat down through stakeholder meetings to say, what's the vision? Well, the vision is something that, what's not to like? An open working landscape where kids have options whether or not to stay or to leave the ranch, but that they're not forced into that decision, that they choose it for themselves, where you know, their education system is as top-notch as we can get it, and it's top-notch because we've folded that whole living laboratory of the cleanup and the restoration into the educational system, so that 10 years worth of students coming through get to be a part of that cleanup and see it for their own eyes and sort of partake and learn. You know, if there's going to be a restoration economy in the West, as there could be, boy, this is one of the places that could create that restoration economy, learn from it, and also create the skills to export. So those are some of the ideas that people came up with, that you know, the mill that is in Deer Lodge stays open and is able to do so by doing stewardship logging and putting the forests back together. So what's not to like about that vision? You know, the fish are back, it's an open working landscape, it's healthy, the economy's good. Like, I want to move there. I mean, you know, what's not to like about that? And so that is so genuinely what's on the table as the vision to work towards. And the only way that doesn't happen by accident. That happens by people working really hard to put it together. And so all of a sudden, conservation is about local economic development. Conservation is about education in schools. Conservation is about, oh yeah, it's also about getting it right on the riparian corridor. But it's about so much more than, is it good for the fish or not? So for example, we launched, the Clark Fork Coalition launched a farmer's market summer before last in Missoula that would sell protein, that would sell beef, so that people, if they wanted to decide about whether or not they were going to get out of the commodity market, which doesn't give them a lot of control. Commodity market being the truck comes, your cows get on the truck, they go away, they get slaughtered, you get a check. And you are at the whim of the market, which runs in 10-year cycles like this, up, down, up, down, up, down. And so one of the ways that the economy of those ranches can stay intact is if they get more money for their cows. One of the ways to get more money for their cows is to go into niche markets. And an example of a niche market is, you know, as niche as it gets, farmer's market, where a farmer's selling to a person. And at first we had people saying to us, "Is a river conservation group opening a farmer's market?" What? That's not about fish. But it is. It absolutely is, because if people have more economic choices, they have the ability to dictate what's going to happen on their land a lot more freely. So that's all a really sort of long way of saying that unless conservation becomes more about community, we are going to flat out not like the place we live, and we're going to lose the sort of royal we. You know, we're all going to look around 40 or 50 years from now and say, remember when we had this incredible place we used to live in? But if we stay really, really, really focused on the old guard ways of doing conservation, which have done very well. You know, we got great laws, we upheld those laws, we sort of haven't lost most of them. Some places have been protected, but in the end, that's a battle that the gap gets, you know, it seems like here's winning, it seems like we're right here, and the gap just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger because the pressures, you know, get bigger and bigger and bigger, and because, talk about being niche-y, conservation for a long time was just focused on conservation, as if it was some other thing, nature, that we're not all a part of. So here we are in one small watershed trying to take on a big experiment that says, what happens when conservation becomes community building? You know, are the results on the ground different in the end? And I'm positing that the answer to that is yes. But boy, we're at the beginning of it. So that was a lot, and it's way more interesting when we open it up to conversation. So,
Tracy, how are you engaging the community of opportunity?
We are engaging opportunity through something called CFR Tech, the Clark Fork River Technical Assistance Committee, which is a citizen group. Superfund. The Superfund law is has many flaws, but it also has some cool things. And one of them is there's money available for citizen-based groups who need to translate these reams of documents that make like no sense to many people. And so the Clark Fork Coalition back in the 80s got the first citizen group founded. It was then MTAC, Milltown Technical Assistance Committee, and then broadened to the Clark Fork River Technical Assistance Committee. Gets money from the EPA to hire technical people to sort of translate these documents. And so we still serve on the board, and CFR Tech reached out to Opportunity after the controversy of the Milltown sediments going to Opportunity, and said, wait a second, there's this river. It flows by your town, comes right down to ours. It is the thing that connects us. This isn't about us versus them. It shouldn't be about us versus them. It should be about how do we all work together to ensure that this cleanup is as good as it can be for everybody. And so we're now working with Opportunity to push ARCO into better monitoring of those ponds. Let me back up. Opportunity ponds were the settling ponds for the smelter, that very same smelter that, you know, in its early days, it didn't burn very cleanly and killed whole herds of sheep. The slag from that smelter would be put in these ponds. Water would be put on top of it to keep it stable and to keep it from blowing away. And when the Atlantic Richfield Company, ARCO, announced in the late 1980s that it was shutting down the smelter, by the way, with a day's notice, said we're shutting down and it's going to be tomorrow. Not only did that sort of send the community reeling economically, but then this other problem surfaced, which was they no longer kept all that waste submerged. There are, I should know this off the top of my head. Hundreds of millions, I believe, if not tens of millions, but I think it's hundreds. Long weekend, figure escaping me. Cubic yards of sediments that are there from the decades and decades and decades of smelting. And then 2 million more were going to come as a result of Milltown's cleanup. There are train loads coming every day from the Silverbow Creek cleanup. There will be train loads coming from the Clark Fork cleanup as well. An Opportunity saying, like, when did we become the dumping grounds? And the really harsh, awful answer is the day ARCO left. And the day ARCO all of a sudden got into the reclamation business, all that waste has to go someplace. And there's this de facto repository there because it's already got all of this waste. Let's just add to that, then cap it, and cap it with soil, and revegetate it so that it stays stable. Now, the problem is, it's 3,600 acres. It looks like the moon. It looks like this table out there. It is a freakish landscape. Nothing grows on it. And I talked to a guy from ARCO about it, and he said, you know, we're in the farming business. And he's right. I mean, they have to bring in compost. They have to build and create soil before they can cap that waste. In the meantime, guess what? It's the upper Clark Fork. The wind blows. And it picks up a bunch of dust. And so they've got a problem which is expensive to fix. And they think because Opportunity is pushing them hard, and because citizens have said, I mean, ARCO would not be doing this unless citizens said, we're done. You know, we are done with this dust. They have begun to identify some cells. The site is broken up into things called cells. You know, it's just a big grid, basically. And they think that they've identified the cells that have sort of the finest particulate matter, and they're treating it with mag chloride. They're treating now all their roads with mag chloride to keep dust down. And you know, the end game is it's all vegetated. You know, when all the cleanup is done, and when they're really done and they really have left, the end game is, you know, a big site with grass on it that we can't ever develop ever. at least with the current technology that we all are living with in 2006. But meanwhile, there's a community in a town called Opportunity right next door to it. The incredible irony being the company built the town of Opportunity. They named it Opportunity because it was people's opportunity to live away from pollution. Where they would, it was a sort of brilliant idea in that there was clustered development, small town clustered development with horse pastures on the outside, so that all the open space was shared, and a town had a little town, and they called it Opportunity. I mean, a writer can do a lot with that irony, but you know, who cares about that? There are still people living there. So that's also a long-winded.
Well, it's fascinating because, you know, it does have a history of being sort of a dumping ground from ARCO.
Sure.
And are those ponds lined?
No.
So what prevents those toxins from leaching out?
There's a ground.
They like sealed themselves.
There's a groundwater plume. I mean, there is a plume of water underneath those ponds that is, you know, not drinkable, and the theory is that we catch that water, treat it, and then release it, and that there are wells on the outside to monitor that groundwater plume to see if it extends. It's fairly stable, in part because we're talking about 10 inches of rain there a year. 9 to, I mean, it's not a lot of moisture, so so as a result, there's just not a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tracy, when you're saying $100 million, is that referring to money both for dam removal and for restoration, riparian restoration?
No. In fact, $100 million is low.
Okay.
Let me run through the economics pretty quickly. The Milltown cleanup is about, and we say about because they hired a private company, and so they don't have to disclose what it's really going to cost. But rough estimates are $90 to $100 million on the Milltown dam removal and cleanup, and with some additional restoration thrown in. The Upper Clark Fork, the original estimates were $120 million for just the cleanup, just remediation. Remediation being sort of the legal definition under Superfund that says getting the toxins out. Very different than restoration. There is a claim against ARCO from the state of Montana. Another good thing about the Superfund law says that states can sue the company for damages over and above remediation to sort of bring it back to historical standards. And so Montana has done that. They've partially settled claims in the Clark Fork Basin, and that pot of money sits now at about, it's because it's been gaining interest, about $160 million. And that is for restoration only. And we are waiting for them to settle the last claim, which is the Clark Fork River. And when they settle that last claim, they'll roll the remediation cleanup plan into a restoration plan. And nobody, sort of the horrible part of this is nobody knows what that restoration is going to look like, because all of the negotiations are happening under a judge's gag order behind closed doors. So again, the community of Deer Lodge is saying, well, we don't know what we're going to be hit with this restoration plan. We don't get a say. And the ugly truth is they don't. We don't, nobody does, except the lawyers for the state, the lawyers for ARCO, the lawyers for the tribe. The tribes because it's original hunting grounds. So, so there will be an additional pot of money available for restoration over and above that 160. So, you know, add it all up, and ballpark $300 to $400 million being spent in the Upper Clark Fork as defined by the confluence of the Blackfoot at Milltown up over the next decade. That's transformative. And if that doesn't turn into transformation for the human communities as well, we absolutely, I think, will have failed. Yeah.
I like your mission change from the basin to the watershed, and also like the link to the market that you did.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about the health of the whole watershed, do you envision that you're going to network with other organizations, or you're going to have to start your own sustainable development division of the Clark Fork Coalition because
Right.
looking upstream, if that all develops in a scattered way like the Bitterroot, and it could be worse, could be better, but the point being, how can you have plans or ideas about shaping that whole development beyond the markets? You have to get into the chemical uses, the transportation, the energy, all of that.
Yeah. And because we can't do that all, I can envision seeing somebody on staff who really knows it and knows how to do it right and well. And that person working with other economic development groups. You know, there's a small local economic development group in Powell County in Deer Lodge, and we're working with them in the community planning process to say, you know, what should it look like? That we see ourselves as sort of the people out there saying, hey, this should probably be done, and then going and finding the levers and the resources for communities to do it themselves. Because there's just no way. I mean, growth growth policy is something that we work on at the coalition, and now sort of say, boy, growth is the sort of the new mining in western Montana. Like that mines are an identified threat. A cyanide heap leach mine on the Blackfoot River, identified threat. We know exactly what's going to happen. You know, we know how to sort of advocate against to stop it. Well, unregulated growth is sort of a death by 1,000 cuts that adds up eventually to something as bad as a cyanide heap leach mine for the integrity of the system, if not worse. And so there are 7 of us at the coalition, and we could all work 60-hour weeks on nothing but growth alone and still be way behind. And so now we're saying, okay, how if we keep our focus sort of watershed-based, clean water-based, we could go subdivision by subdivision and become crazy people. Or we could try to enact some policies at the state level that sort of do it in one fell swoop. So it's back to that old kind of conservation that we know how to do and know how to do pretty well. But not only back it this time sort of with science of, and this is why it's good for water, this is why it's good for fish, air, but then also back it with, yeah, and oh, by the way, communities are healthier economically when we do this right. Anything else?
Is the strategy for, keeping like the growth from engulfing this area would be to make the ranchers more economically viable?
Absolutely.
Instead of, say, legislation, it's just to make the economics of it where the land is more valuable under agriculture than it is under development, which is kind of a hard...
I think it's impossible. It's never going to be possible for cows to pencil higher than golf course condos. It's never going to happen. But I think that there are some regulatory mechanisms in place to say, as a culture, we value a rural ranching lifestyle, and so we're going to support it. And here are the ways we are going to support it. Can one of those ranchers finally just say, you know what, I've worked 7 days a week for 70 years, I'm out? Yes, of course, that's his or her prerogative. But is there a way to give them the exit strategy that then keeps it in a working landscape? Yeah. With that pot of money, can you say, okay, we're going to buy a conservation easement for your place, enjoy Cancun? And yeah. So those are some of the sort of regulatory things. Or, we as a culture, we subsidize farming in the country because we care about farming, because we believe that farming is an important and good thing to do, and that we should be able to grow our own food. So we subsidize the heck out of it. In Choteau County, the county that John Tester is from. What year was it? Let's just say sometime in the late 90s, or maybe even 2000. 6 farmers in that county did not get checks from the federal government. 6. The rest of them, the only way they can make it is checks from the federal government. And the federal government sends them because we care about farming. And so the question then becomes, how do we take that kind of subsidy and shape it in a way that's also good for the landscape? You know, if we subsidize below market timber sales because we care about putting people to work in the woods and we care about, you know, getting the wood out on forests, how do we just take that a quarter turn and say, we're going to spend all that subsidy not on road building, but on putting people to work in the woods to put our woods back together. And by the way, as a result, getting some wood. It's the same concept. That is, government subsidizing something that culture values. And there's no reason that subsidy couldn't come in a form that was good for both place and people.
It looks like we're out of time.
We are.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks.